Orthodox, but not only for the Orthodox, I think for the world heritage, to discuss this and see what else, if this happens now, will it happen to other buildings like St. Sophia? Over to you, Father. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Father Anastasios, for your really beautiful your words describing the importance of Hagia Sophia. The question that you raised, a rhetorical question, with all of this meaning for the Orthodox, for the Byzantines, for us, for all Christians, how can the Hagia Sophia be anything but the great Church of Christ? How can it be a museum? How can it be a mosque? And that's what I'm going to try and explore now, because, as you stated, it currently is, its legal status has been converted to a mosque, right? It's important, though, to remember that it hasn't functioned as a church for some time, and we are not necessarily, I think, as Christians, as upset about its being converted from a museum, right? Because I don't think that many of us really ever truly thought that it was a museum. But there are a number of cases, especially in the USSR, where churches were converted into museums, and that was a horrible thing. They were used as museums of religion and atheism, etc. Right? So we just have a little bit of a broader context. It's not that we bemoan that it is no longer a museum necessarily, but that it has been handed over to Islamic worship. There have been a number of conversations and statements about this change over the past week or so. And there has been a lot of sympathy actually coming from more progressive Muslim societies, for example. And one of the main charges is that there's this assertion that it's actually against Islamic law to convert a church into a mosque. And that there are strict rules set out in order for the construction of a mosque, that there needs to be a proper ownership deed, etc. And we've seen some kind of very dubious looking documents that are retroactively claiming to be these ownership documents. Now, the problem that we have here realistically is for those that see Hagia Sophia as a mosque, and the people that have pushed for it to be converted in and used for Islamic worship today, don't truly see it as a conversion. Okay, and even in 1453, that was also not a conversion, according to a large portion of Turkish and wider Islamic folk tales, legends, etc. In fact, what they postulate is that it was a mosque from its very foundation. Okay, so it's important, although we, as or historians or Orthodox, we know the history of the building. It's important for us to understand the perspective here. Especially when people make comments, oh, it's illegal, etc., etc. However, if they have supplied a foundation myth, which has been known around the Islamic world for a number of centuries, then they get around this idea of converting it, okay? So there are a couple of points that I'm going to go through. And I'm going to try not to get into the weeds too much. But the first point is that the conversion or the contestation of Hagia Sophia and of Constantinople itself actually begins at the earliest stage of Islam and the movement of the Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula into the Mediterranean. And a lot of it is wrapped up actually in the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. The second point is that the Arab sieges of Constantinople are taken actually as some of the first foundational moments of Islam in Constantinople. The founding, for example, of the first mosques is traced to this time. And I'll go through some of the philological process and mental gymnastics that you need to accomplish to come to that conclusion in a few minutes. The third one is that the Umayyad Caliphate desired to emulate, incorporate, and assume Byzantine imperial power in Syria while Islam was in its adolescence by incorporating sacra, by incorporating relics and architectural devices into its capital of Damascus. The fourth is that there was a large, consistent presence of Muslims in the city from, if we believe Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, 717, which is also the beginning of the second Arab siege of Constantinople. The Ottoman and pre-Ottoman legends and the construction of historical memory based on the Patria and other histories of Constantinople, I want to talk to you about. And then also the incorporation directly of Islamic relics into the building of Hagia Sophia is very important as well. So I'll just start at the beginning. In the Hadith literature, which is referenced time and time again, it's directly referenced by Mehmed at the actual last push, right? The words of Muhammad, how blessed will that commander be when he takes the city, etc. Of course, we really don't have any way of knowing if this is something that Muhammad said. However, the importance is not diminished by it, right? It was taken as a prophecy, and the fulfillment of Muslim Arab expansion across the Mediterranean. So very soon after the death of Muhammad, we have the Arab raids, and there's a very important figure, Al-Ansari, who dies in a very, dies, and then a hagiography sprouts up about this person, what his final wishes were, that he should be buried with his feet inside the walls of the city. There's also a story which pops up fairly early on as well, that the siege was paused in order to let Al-Ansari into Constantinople so that he may pray in Hagia Sophia. Now, for those of you, I'm sure that some of you have heard that in general terms, it's accepted that any building in which a Muslim prays becomes a mosque. This was used as justification for converting numerous churches, not just at the beginning of the spread of Islam, but also churches within Constantinople during the siege of 1453, the Pamakaristos Church, for example, and others, Little Hagia Sophia, St. Sergius and Bacchus. This was the same device that was used for these. We'll see, though, that whether Al-Ansari prayed in the church of Hagia Sophia or not is not the important point. The important point is that according to the Ottoman reading of the legends surrounding the founding of the church, that it was designed to be a mosque from its very inception. So let me see here. So I mentioned the incorporation of Constantinopolitan architecture just very briefly a moment ago. The example that I'd like to give is the Church of St. John the Baptist in Damascus, which was used for shared worship between Muslims and Christians for about 70 years after the capture of the city. It was located actually within a temple precinct, and we're not really sure whether it was one building, but it was contained in a single precinct. Now, the reason that Muslims chose that area to pray was because it contained the relics, the head actually of St. John the Baptist. It formed a sacred center in the city, and there was not this kind of attitude that we assume in many ways is common among Muslims today, that relics, for example, are forbidden, are unclean. Okay, the early years of Islam see enormous public use of relics, both Christian and otherwise. We think about Ali, for example, the Caliph. His head was venerated as well. There are processions that are clearly modeled on Byzantine processions, and in fact, the Umayyad calendar itself incorporated a number of feasts, particularly of saints that were very popular in Syria, like Saint George, Saint Sergius. These were incorporated into the official Islamic calendar. So it shouldn't be that surprising then that as the Muslim population grows in Syria and outgrows that space, that they take over then the shrine of St. John the Baptist, right? And it's, the claim is that the head is still there in the Grand Umayyad Mosque. But it's not just incorporating the sacred power of the Christian community, but also of Byzantium, right? We know how sacred power works. This is why Constantine brought as many relics as he possibly could into the city, right, to consecrate it, to mark it off as a center of Christian sacred power. But they also use architecture to evoke imperial power as well, and legitimacy. There's a really funny story, actually, of I think that it was Mansur. There was an early Umayyad Caliph who took a Byzantine person from Constantinople, actually, out and showed him his palace. And the Constantinopolitan remarked that it looked like a dove coop, right? Because it was made out of earth, and it wasn't very sophisticated. And he quickly started a building campaign then, because he was embarrassed, along Constantinopolitan lines. We see in Damascus direct copies, actually, of the Halki Gate, for example, the Horologion, the water clock, which was at the side of Hagia Sophia. And it's been interpreted in a number of ways. One is it's not just mimicking, and it's not it doesn't just evoke Constantinople. What it does is it demonstrates a desire to fulfill that prophecy that Constantinople will be the next city. That's part of the narrative, and actually the building, for example, of the Damascus Mosque ties right in with that last siege of Constantinople as well. So it's always a focus on the future, on the future fulfillment of the prophecy of Muhammad. Yes. So let me see. So the Muslim community of Constantinople, right? Again, it's dated to the beginning of the 8th century. There are numerous references in the Byzantine texts to mosques inside the imperial city. That sometimes comes as a bit of a shock, and it's been largely ignored in Western sources. But we know that they were there, and not just because of the imperial patronage, because the emperors were patrons of these mosques, and also actually patrons of the Prophet's mosque in Medina, for example. But because of the way that the Westerners, when they arrived in 1204, behaved, they were scandalized to see mosques. They were scandalized to see this this hated enemy resident in Constantinople, and they attacked the mosque. Actually, the first mosque there, and tried to burn it down. Nikitas Choniatis says that the Byzantines defended the mosque and the resident Muslims. So there must have been some kind of wider Constantinopolitan camaraderie between them. They'd been there for a long time. Maybe this isn't so surprising because there had also been Jewish communities there, but it's very unusual for the time that we're talking about, because in Western Europe, cities excluded religious minorities. This is very unusual, right? The point is that those Islamic communities that were there developed their own history within the city as well. So we shouldn't only think about the transfer or the conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque in terms of the conquest of the 15th century. We should be thinking about it as probably a fulfillment of the desire of an element of the population that had been resident in the city from the 8th century on. Now, there are a lot of notes that have been left by Persian travelers, etc., that speak about Hagia Sophia in amazed terms. In general, Muslim travelers were not allowed into Hagia Sophia. They weren't forbidden by any of the church authorities, but the custom, at least in the 10th century, was that everyone had to prostrate themselves before a great cross, which was at the entrance. And because it was against their Islamic sensibilities, they didn't do so, right? But it didn't stop them from measuring its proportions, reproducing its architecture elsewhere, and it didn't stop it from having a very important place in their imagination. So let me just get to the first pre-Ottoman legend, and it's essentially lifted from the Patria. When the Patria records Justinian's refounding, right, of Hagia Sophia, which had been destroyed in the riots, he is visited by an angel. This is the story, and the angel describes to him, the proportions, or inspires him. There are a number of meetings between him and this angel. Sometimes he's in the guise of someone else in disguise, as a eunuch at one point. And so the main point is that the final meeting between Justinian and the angel promises that he will stay in the church. In fact, Justinian tries to trick him into staying. Now I think about it, because the angel says, "Send for the emperor now, so that we can complete this dome." And the emperor doesn't go back, so that the angel will stay there forever. Right? This is the idea. I can give you the precise details, but in the pre-Ottoman imagining of this tale, the person that appears to Justinian is Qidr, or Al-Qidr, who is a time-traveling Islamic saint. Okay, it's a good way of getting around things if you have a time-traveling saint. But he appears to him and gives him the plan and says, I'm presenting this to you, from beyond. This will be, the great temple. And so the idea is that with the future in mind, it is an eschatological religion like ours. He sets the foundation stone for a mosque, and it's not just a mosque, right? It's actually technically the first one, because Muhammad is born in 571, according to tradition, and Justinian, of course, is building in the beginning of the 6th century, right? 537, I think, is the beginning of construction. So it's technically the first mosque, a mosque that precedes even the birth of the Islamic prophet. So it does have enormous significance. That significance is then increased by the second part of this reinterpretation. And that is that when the dome collapsed in 558, well, first off, okay, so here we have run into some of the inconsistencies which you might have expected, right? If Muhammad is born in 571, the dome collapses in 558, but we're told in the Islamic sources that the dome collapses along with a lot of other monumental buildings because of the birth of Muhammad, right? It's a big moment, and the arch of Khosrow, for example, in Iran is destroyed. The dome of Hagia Sophia comes down. Now the angel, or Qidr, appears again and says, you won't be able to put this dome back together again. You don't have any mortar that's strong enough. You don't have the skill required to do it. But a boy has been born, and if you send your priests to him, you will collect from him a bowl of saliva. You will take earth from Mecca and water from the well of Zamzam. And the Zamzam is, in the Quran, there is an incident where a boy is dying of thirst in the desert, and the angel Gabriel appears to him, strikes the ground, and out comes, miraculous water. So water from this holy well, earth from the holy site of Mecca, and the saliva of the prophet, and you bring this back and make mortar. It's the only thing that is strong enough. Now, this is done, right, according to the legend, and the dome is now secure. Now, very importantly, what this means is, if we think about it from if we think about it with relics in mind, there are relics of Muhammad, right? But there's nothing that's more sort of an imminent embodiment than his own DNA. he is therefore embodied in the actual building itself, which is very, very significant to Muslims. Okay, this is why Hagia Sophia was called the poor man's Hajj, because if you couldn't afford to go to Mecca, you'd go instead to the Hagia Sophia, and you are simultaneously in Mecca because it has the earth there surrounding you. It has the blessing of the miraculous water and the physical embodiment of the Prophet. And of course, according to legend, it's also the first mosque as well. Now, I think that there was a deliberate emphasis on some of this incorporation of relics because as Hagia Sophia is dedicated to Jesus Christ, and of course there are no relics, no physical relics because of the ascension, that Hagia Sophia, not that it was empty of relics, but it didn't have the same kind of sacred pull in terms of relic veneration as, say, some of the other imperial churches, the Pharos Church, for example, where it was like an imperial treasure box. You have all of the significant relics there. They would be brought out, of course, to be venerated at Hagia Sophia, but there were very few that were there for any length of time. And in fact, if you look at some of the items that were there, one of the most significant was the processional cross, which was thought to be, was designed to be exactly the height of Jesus Christ. And there were also the swaddling band from the Nativity. Now, these relics, of course, you know, in the Western sense, you would call them secondary relics because they're not, lipsano, they're not bodily. Okay, so I think that knowing this, that there was a deliberate effort to say, well, look, actually, we've got physical relics of the Prophet there. So we come back to the question, basically, can you convert it into a mosque? Well, you can. All of this does is sidestep that issue entirely. And they say we don't need to convert it into a mosque because it was founded as a mosque. It's the oldest mosque. Now, can Erdogan say that with a straight face? It certainly serves him well, right? Does he believe it? I would say almost certainly not. But how could he possibly override this history? How could he possibly dismiss long-held Turkish beliefs without being impious? Especially when we think about the way that he's talking about expanding currently in terms of the Dome on the Rock, for example, and behaving a lot like a sultan, I would say. If he's going to use imperial language, then he's going to have to take full advantage of the sacred remembering of the city itself. That's something that was very important in 1453, when a lot of these legends were written down, and we have manuscripts of them. We have some of the first collated manuscripts, and they start in about 1480, deliberately put together at the behest of Mehmed, in order to give legitimacy, in order to associate the new emperor's rule as part of prophecy, and not just Islamic prophecy. You know, they talk about Alexander. They talk also about Justinian in a very unusual way. They they talk about Justinian as a kind of Josiah-esque purifier of pagan polytheism in Constantinople. They associate Constantine with polytheism, and Justinian, in a way, is seen as a kind of a Muslim before they're Muslims, because he purges the polytheism according to this legend. We know this isn't accurate, right? But it's part of the legend. So there are lots and lots of interesting questions that this raises, I think. How we make sacred space, it's not just architecture, it's not just physical building or ritual, but memory plays such an enormous role. Conscious remembering. If we think about, just the word, I like to split it up. But if you have memory and then before it, what you're doing is putting together the members, right, like back on a body. And you can kind of make it conform to whatever ideology is important to you at that particular moment. We're guilty of it, all of us. Anytime that we write a history of something, it's instantly not accurate, right? Because it has to conform to our own knowledge of the event, our own language, our own skill, our own perspective. I feel quite comfortable now, I think, to be honest, to open the conversation, because I don't want to take up too much. I'm sure that there are many interesting questions and comments. If we're talking about Hagia Sophia, everything that I've talked about right now with you is mainly from Arab, Persian, and Turkish sources. But I'm not saying that they're more important, for example. But when we think about, is this legal according to Islamic law, which is something that's been raised over and over and over again, we have to engage with these sources, because we know what the great church is. And whether it's a museum or a mosque, it certainly doesn't make any difference to us. We know what it is. We know what it represents. So, yeah, let's have the conversation, everyone. I can see that the chat has a number of questions.
Thank you, Father, for that. That was amazing, actually, and very interesting to see the sort of Islamic relationship between Hagia Sophia and Islam and Byzantium. I didn't know that there were Arabs or Muslims in Constantinople before the fall, so that was interesting. It reminds me a bit of the Greeks. They have myths and legends as well in regards to Saint Sophia and Constantinople. With the fall of the city, the priest ran into one of the doors, and he will come out again when the city is free, and so continue the liturgy. So that's a Greek myth. Or another myth of the emperor who will come again out and rule the city again. So it reminded me of that, especially the thing you said about the mud from Mecca and so on, being part of the building of the church. I'm sure we do have questions from the people, and please, if people, I know we have some in the chat. There was a question on what is the Patriarch, because you referred to that a number of times, and then how politicized is this whole thing that's happened now. And Father Andrew now asked, how common among 21st century Muslims is this belief that Hagia Sophia was a mosque from its foundation? That's a very interesting question. So Father David, if you can answer these, that would be great. And then people can, you can unmute yourselves, probably put your hand up, unmute yourselves, and then ask Father David your questions.
Okay, so the Patria is just a collection of a number of historical works that deal with the founding of Constantinople, and then also the significance of certain monuments in the serpent column, for example, and a number of other prominent monuments. It's collected over a number of centuries. It's not very reliable. It has a good sense of humor in there, actually. I think that, we tend to read things from a very kind of sober point of view. But it's well worth reading. There's a really good edition of it that came out recently from the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library, which I recommend to you. It's not that long, but it has the whole story of the dialogue between Justinian and the angel, and it's it's very interesting. I'm sorry, what was the second question?
It's in the chat, so I just took it from there. So how common, from Father Andrew, how common among 21st century Muslims is this belief that Hagia Sophia was a mosque from its foundation?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because I don't think that even the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque now is necessarily a popular decision amongst the majority of Muslims. I don't. However, the legend itself, I don't know how I would be able to answer that question. I don't know. Certainly, it's something that everyone is aware of, and I'm sure that a number of the Islamic scholars, muftis, etc., accept these stories. It's more important from an imperial perspective than it is a religious one in many ways, because it legitimates the conquest, it legitimates the presence of the Turks there, not just there, but don't forget, the next stop was supposed to be Rome, right? It legitimates the whole movement. The idea that Mehmed is not just a conqueror, not just a hero of Islam, but he is the legitimate Roman emperor, that he is the next Alexander, right? All of those things that were said about him, including in the Greek sources. You think about Critobulus, he was trying to convert him to Christianity, because he was sure that the next stop was going to be Rome, and it certainly was supposed to be. There are a number of practices amongst Muslims now in Turkey, and I'm thinking about the Church of St. George on Prince's Island, which a couple of studies have come out about. On the Feast of St. George, thousands and thousands of Turkish Muslims go, and they put in their prayer requests, but also they baptize their children, okay, and dedicate their children to St. George. In the Coptic Church, there's a separate baptism service for Muslims, where you have a two-tiered baptism, which is theological, very, very theologically dubious, that you can have a two-tiered baptism. But the idea is that if a Muslim couple brings their child to you to be baptized for whatever reason, whether it's because they believe it's good luck or whatever, that you use a slightly different formulation. That is extremely common still in the Eastern Mediterranean, all the way up through Egypt, Palestine, and still in parts of Turkey as well. So I would say that even if they don't believe it, because how on earth do you determine if someone believes anything, right? Even if they don't believe the legend of Hagia Sophia, there is acceptance of sacra, of sacred power outside of the defined parameters of a Sunni Islamic orthodoxy.
Okay, Albion, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
I think I'm unmuted, am I?
Yes.
Yes. I apologize, but I got a bit distracted when you were introducing Kidda and the legend.
Yeah.
While I mentioned it, I can't find the name on Google. How do you spell Kidda?
Let me type it to you right now.
Okay.
So generally appears like this. So A-L, and then K-H-I-D-R, like this.
No wonder I didn't find it. Okay.
Also known as the Green Man.
So if I understand what you're saying is this angel or whatever he was went to Constantinople in the 6th century and organized the building of the temple, because he did this before Muhammad was even born.
That's correct.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand the basics of the legend and the time frame, because this is beyond absurd unless you, of course, believe in this idea of time travel.
Yeah, well, look, you know, there are lots of ways to get around to it. I mean, yes, it's a mosque before Islam, and you know, I think that but to be fair, I think, is it not Justin Martyr that said of the even the pre-Socratic philosophers that they were Christians without even knowing it, because they pursued wisdom, and wisdom is a person, and that person is Jesus Christ. You know,
No,
I'm not talking equivalency, but I'm saying that this is something that's common to a lot of traditions.
David, there's a question on the chat from James. How do the Turks perceive this whole thing these days? Would they support this, the change from museum to mosque, or would they react to it in a way?
Well, look, you know, that example there of the destruction of those Buddhist statues is a really good one. If you think from a historic point of view, Muhammad didn't destroy previous sites of foreign worship, pre-Islamic worship. The Kaaba itself, right, was a temple belonging to polytheistic tradition. It's probably an icon in there from the Christian tradition. He didn't destroy it. When the conquests went out into Egypt, for example, there was not even a widespread desire to convert the populace to Islam. The idea was that you would have a hierarchy that was Islamic, and everyone else could pay that lovely tax to you, because if they become Muslims, then they are exempt from that tax. So that's the last thing that you want in many ways, right? Now, Islamic extremists, when I began my PhD project, I was writing about the church, a church of St. George in Iraq that also functioned as a mosque. Okay, it was around reported that they had relics there, and it was a shared space. Of course, ISIS comes along within 4 months of me writing about this and blows the thing sky high. So I'm not saying it's an entirely modern phenomenon, but people are a lot less tolerant when spaces become ambiguous than in the past. Certainly Muhammad, we know about his protection of the monastery of Saint Katherine. There are lots of examples, right? Lots of people point to the Caliph who took Syria, Omar, and his agreement with the Christians there that the temples would not be destroyed and people would not be harassed. There were other rules that were put in place, like you couldn't rebuild a church perhaps, or you couldn't enlarge a church. Similar rules that the Roman Empire enforced on its Jewish population, for example, in order to maintain cultural and spatial urban dominance. This kind of stuff, the blowing up of temples and of statues, I think is really a sign of our modern times. I honestly, I'm not the person to ask what the Turkish population is going to do with it. I think it's I couldn't possibly. I'm just not qualified. I'm not in a position to speak on it. It certainly is very useful for a despotic ruler to demonstrate his extreme piety, right, and appeal to certain elements within society that favor the re-emergence of an Ottoman identity or Islamic law. It's kind of like how Reza Shah faced an enormous backlash in Iran when he saw the reforms of Ataturk, and he also adopted a westernization process and said no more veiling, women don't need to be chaperoned. There was a huge backlash, and I think that this kind of politics is appealing to those people that favor sort of religious rule, like in Iran, for example. I hope that I hope that there is an internationalist kind of mentality here, that people will say this is a monument that is important to all people, and that they will vote, which is the only thing that I suppose they can do. I'm not sure how successful that will be, but yeah. Are there any other questions or comments?
I'd like to go next if nobody else has another one. It's Alex Kyriakou from Northwest London. There's a lot that has been written over the last week or so since the announcement of President Erdogan to convert Hagia Sophia to a mosque. That has been written. I was certainly one of the early ones at 4 o'clock in the morning, the following morning, to react on LinkedIn and other media. The whole world, talks about, desecration, talks about a desecration of an ecumenical monument. It talks about a complete despising of the spiritual orientation of the Western world, a big chasm of ecumenical character. I'm personally very highly skeptical and extremely concerned, obviously, what the consequences will be. And I think they're going to be sizable and deeply felt into the future. But I'd like to reduce this sort of rhetoric that goes on in the media around the world to a very fundamental question. If we need a basis to resolve the use of Hagia Sophia and such like monuments, whether that's going to be a theological, whether it's going to be a political or geopolitical, or up until now we had UNESCO that acted as the sort of the referee that decided that the use in the last sort of 100 years or so, that the use of Hagia Sophia should be that of a museum. Now, it seems that it has now become a political issue. It has been the use of micropolitics and personal vanity and glorification of President Erdogan. And, and my question is, who should decide the destiny of such kind of monuments, on the basis that, the Muslims believe that everyone is born a Muslim. So on that basis alone, we can't have a rational argument. You need a rational speaker that's prepared to rationalize on an objective basis. But the current political government doesn't seem to have that trait. Therefore, everything that's been discussed around the media in the world is a wish list.
Yeah.
And if economical an economical embargo will resolve the problems and will revert that decision, then that will even more make it obvious that we're talking about a sort of a political issue rather than a theological issue.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Very, very good points. I mean, this is difficult, right? Because we already know UNESCO has limited powers. Look at the status or the treatment of a number of UNESCO sites in Kosovo, for example. A country's borders may very well be imaginary, but they're very hard to overcome in some ways. And I would say, you know, Father Anastasios said at the beginning, he drew, you know, he mentioned the Elgin marbles. You know, this is like we talk about, you know, I think there's a temptation to say, you know, rational, therefore like secular. This is a secular example, the Elgin marbles. There is no rational reason why they should not be returned. It's not a rational, you know, there is no religious reason why we should hold on to them. And I say we, I mean, the UK, right? There's no rational reason. There's no religious motivation. And yet this is devoid of all of this religious meaning as well. So if we can't get that right, I don't have a whole lot of faith in international organizations even being able to right this wrong, particularly when Turkey is such a valued partner in the Middle East for, say, the United States. Particularly when populist politics seems to be growing and is being looked at as a legitimate form of rule. So I don't know how we have the conversation going forward. Honestly, I mean, I really don't. Sanctions, I don't know.
But can I just go back to the point? I mean, do we feel that turning Hagia Sophia into a museum has not been a desecration? Turning it into a mosque, as if there are enough mosques in Turkey, people have said that before many times, will be desecration and an attack to the Christian values.
Yeah, that's a really key point, because if we were talking about,
I don't know if have I lost the signal? Maybe I've lost the signal.
I think I heard the whole question. I think that if we were talking about a similar situation in, say, the USSR, where a church was turned into a museum, that would certainly be viewed as a desecration. But we have this additional element of the Islamic character or Islamic associations with the building as well. So where do we say that the building was desecrated? I mean, the building has been treated very, very badly by a lot of people over many centuries, right? Starting, you know, actually starting within Byzantium, the iconoclasm, but you know, the West through the Crusades, and then certainly, you know, Islamic domination. It's this question about ritual purity and purity of the space. And it's also a question of, can something, once it is consecrated, become secular or profane again? It's a question that can't really properly be answered, because if an ontological change has happened at a space, how on earth can human actions undo the actions of the divine? It's an impossibility to someone. Well, my own perspective, I see that as an impossibility. However, if you drop a bomb on something and it doesn't exist anymore, because our own, we don't see the physical remains, etc., etc. How do you know? How do you know it's still sacred? How do you answer that question? It's a really difficult question I keep thinking about, and I'm really interested in it because of the way that sacred spaces are accepted in other religions. You know, you may totally disagree with the religious dogma of another person, but you may very well enter a space and say, I am in a holy space. I am in a sacred space. It happens time and time again. And, you know, this is not just something that happens with people in the monotheistic religions. It happens on a far more broad scale as well. The recognition of sacra. Of course, if that wasn't the case, if there wasn't cross-denominational or cross-religious recognition of sacra, we wouldn't be in this mess to begin with. because it wouldn't have been used as a mosque. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but it's a very important thing to think about, I think.
Thank you, Father. There's a question from Georgia. Supposing that Erdogan is no longer president tomorrow, is there any chance that Hagia Sophia returns to its former status? Is it a matter of Erdogan's policy or the whole political systems in Turkey? And then I have questions afterwards.
Sure. I think there's a very good chance that that would happen, because I think that the legacy of Ataturk will be far more, long-lived and influential than Erdogan's. Yeah, I don't think that there's much problem with imagining that scenario happening. And I would just say, just as a caveat, not that that is a positive legacy. I entirely disagree. There have been statements that have come out that have evoked Ataturk as some enlightened leader. No.
Turkey would support that idea rather than the rest of the world, maybe. But going on from what you said before, I mean, in this country, in the UK, we have massive issues with churches being converted constantly to theatres, clubs, mosques. Mm-hmm. So since selling the building to Muslims for it to be a mosque, in my area here, there's a church that has become a Hindu temple. The worst one, I mean, you can probably say it's a different context, but the worst one, I think, is when they convert them to houses. Mm-hmm. I was taken out once to Nottingham, and in Nottingham, the most beautiful bar is the next church. And it's a very weird feeling. I had to leave. I said, I can't stay in here and have a drink in the church.
Yeah, I think that that's so interesting. That's so interesting. There is in the Church of England there are a set of prayers to deconsecrate a building, and then there's the removal of the altar stone, for example. But I have not been able to come across anything like that in the Orthodox tradition. But I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I just haven't come across anything like that.
Yeah.
There's no such a thing in the Orthodox Church. If you consecrate a building or the altar, because when you consecrate a church building, you consecrate first of all the altar. The Archbishop, when he consecrates, first of all stays in the altar place around the altar table for quite some time, and then he consecrates the rest of the building. When you consecrate, it's consecrated forever.
Yeah.
Father Raphael has a question, I think.
Okay.
Thank you. The question that I want to ask you, we've talked a lot, or you have talked a lot about the Islamic belief about the building, Hagia Sophia. What is the Orthodox Christian belief when it was started? You go to a simple document like Wikipedia, and it puts down that it became a church in 537. So what is the Orthodox belief of that building? And only later does the Muslim position come forward. If you could maybe just answer that in 2 sentences, I don't expect more than that. Thank you.
No. The Church of Hagia Sophia was built in its current form, with some minor alterations, the Emperor Justinian, on the site of a building that had been rebuilt maybe 2 or 3 times. It was built originally by Emperor Constans, right? And it was destroyed. The old building was destroyed. Justinian was embarking on a long building and spending program. He had started it with the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus there in Constantinople. He also built extensively throughout the frontier between Sasanian Persia and the Eastern Roman Empire. It can be dated to Justinian, and probably it was built because it was burnt down by the Nika riots. And don't forget that Emperor Justinian ordered the death of the figure is generally said to be 30,000 Constantinopolitans who were rioting inside the Hippodrome. And then he immediately starts this building campaign. So it could be seen as maybe a public act of contrition, as well as just the need to rebuild something that was there beforehand. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I just felt that that statement needed to be made as a background for everything else that you said.
Father, are there any more theories like these ones for St. Sophia for the other churches in Constantinople? Because most of them became mosques, not all. But the fear now, I think, is if they started with St. Sophia, what's next? Monitis Horas, the Hora monastery with a beautiful iconography?
Yeah, I mean, it could very well be. You know, let's see. Actually, after the conquest, the Pamakaristos church was used as a patriarchal cathedral. And because it had supposedly been used for prayer at some point, you know, during the looting or whatever that occurred after the city was taken, it was taken away. It couldn't be used as the patriarchal church anymore. That is generally the fate of the churches of Constantinople, that the association with Islam is part of the conquest. There are other churches throughout the Ottoman Empire were appropriated by Firman from the Sublime Porte, citing that as the reason. The example that I mentioned before about the Grand Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, that was signed over because it's very interesting. The general that led the capture of the city marched halfway into the city, and he was halfway in. He had half of the temple under his control, and so they said, well, you know, it can be used for Islamic worship because it was taken during the conquest, half of it. And then they tried to buy the other half of it from the Christian community. Christian community said no. And then there was a very suspicious fire. And the Caliph very generously offered to rebuild, but he rebuilt it only as a mosque. You know, there are a couple of different ways. I think that, honestly, that in terms of Constantinople today, this is it. They have achieved total spatial dominance. There isn't even, I mean, even though it was a museum beforehand, this is it. This is the primary symbol of cultural, religious dominance. There isn't a greater symbol of it than this. So whether they would go on and sort of nitpick, I don't think that it's going to be, I don't think that it's going to be high on the agenda, although I'm not saying it won't happen, you know.
We have a question here, which I didn't know the answer. Wasn't Hora declared a mosque again in November 2019? I'm trying to find it online. I didn't know if that was the case.
I don't think this is the case. I don't think.
Yeah, there was panic about it, but I don't think it was actually done.
The name Karye Jami it's the name that was used during the Muslim use of the building, but they've cleaned all the mosaics and frescoes. It's a very beautiful building, and they use it as museum. And the last time I was there a couple of years ago, they were doing a lot of works because it gives them a lot of money as a museum. Many people go there to admire the mosaic, both the mosaics and the frescoes. The Anastasios, the resurrection icon painting on one semi-dome there. It's the most beautiful icon of the resurrection all around the world, I think. So many people go there and pay a lot of money. Whatever you change from museum to Jami, you stop getting money, you see. And this is one of the arguments that one of the Putin's representatives gave the other day and said that it's good for Christians that St. Sophia has become a mosque because the Christians can go there without paying any money, which is a completely out of the context comment, if not a very silly comment by a Russian Orthodox person. Unbelievable. But anyway, this is politics.
And that we need to, what will happen with the icons now? Because you can't pray in a building that has depictions like the ones I have behind me. So are there plans? We've heard curtains, covers. Have you heard anything, Father?
Yes, what I'd heard is that it will be a mix of screening and lasers. How the lasers will be used in a way that doesn't damage the mosaics, I don't know. And I don't know if that'll be a consideration. I would hope that it would be. But you know, this again, it's kind of a fallacy that prayer can't be conducted by Muslims in a space where, although images are forbidden, of course, there are so many different traditions within Islam, and so many examples of shared spaces even today where Muslims unselfconsciously feel free to pray and leave votive offerings, and you know, there are many cases of that in Bosnia, for example, Palestine.
Lovely, thank you. Do we have any more questions by anyone? No?
You've all had enough.
It's been very interesting, and I think it's a thing that I don't think we've discussed everything in regards to St. Sophia, because I'm sure we could discuss this again when things change within the building, and so we will be worried again to probably discuss and understand. So yes, Father David, thank you very much for this. I'm sure we will have a discussion again about this at some point, if we see that things are changing again and things are getting worse for the Orthodox in Turkey and maybe elsewhere. I mean, I know the sensitivity is in regards to St. Sophia, and a great one for the Orthodox, for all the Orthodox. It's not just a Greek thing, because I have seen on Facebook that Greek flags and so on, but we forget that Byzantium was never Greece and Greece was never Byzantium. So it was a larger than Greece and more ecumenical, more pan-Orthodox. And we need to remember this. And the fact that it has become now a mosque affects all the Orthodox, not just a small part of them.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And how could we expect the Turkish government to behave differently when they won't even grant that our ecumenical patriarchate is indeed ecumenical? It's a real shame. There are lots and lots of things that we could discuss. But I hope that I've brought to light some information maybe that we haven't come across in the past. I think that Erdogan and any other like-minded politician that seeks to take advantage would be a fool not to use this kind of literature. It's imperial gold, I think. So I think it's worth bringing up, and thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for coming and joining our meeting and leading it today. It's a pleasure to have you here at this Forum for Dialogue, which gathered people from many different parts of the world. It's nice to see you again. Hopefully we'll meet again very soon in London or somewhere else, anyway, around the world. Thanks everyone for taking part and for your questions and everything. We're going to have a break now for summer, and we'll let you know soon as to when the Forum for Dialogue and the other session, the Bible study of our community via Zoom meeting, will start in the near future. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Blessings.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Karinita, good night.
Alinita, good night. Bye. Episis, bye.